Rolex was founded by an orphan teenager with no money or connections. The brand is currently valued at around $8 billion, proving that this is a true rags to riches story. Today, we will show you how Hans Wilsdorf created Rolex and how he managed to turn a small business into one of the most expensive luxury brands in the world. Hans Wilsdorf was born in Kulmbach, Germany on March 22, 1881, to Anna and Johann Daniel Wilsdorf. He was the second son of 3 children. His family owned a fairly successful business selling iron goods, a business that was passed down from his grandfather. This made the Wilsdorf family among the middle class, and life was okay until a series of unfortunate events began to happen. His mother fell ill and died in 1892. Like that wasn't enough for the family, Johann Wilsdorf passed away a year later, leaving the 3 children orphaned, including Hans, when he was only 12. The custody of Hans and his siblings was transferred to his mother's uncle, who immediately sold Hans's family's business and put some of the money towards their education. Hans's uncle enrolled them in Ernestinum Coburg, one of the most expensive, prestigious boarding schools at the time. Hans didn't like this arrangement, and it soon began to tell on him. Hans was also bullied and teased by the other boys in the school for behaving like an outsider. Hans focused more on school to avoid being teased and became really good at mathematics and language, which would later help him on his journey to success. In his autobiography, Hans said, "Our uncles were not indifferent to our fate. Nevertheless, the way in which they made me become self-reliant very early in life made me acquire the habit of looking after my possession, and looking back, I believe that it is to this that much of my success is due." Hans soon became skilled in French and English. He also became really curious about traveling the world. Eventually, Hans made friends with a Swiss boy who would tell him about his birthplace, La Chaux de Fonds, a city located in Switzerland that was well known for its rich history in watchmaking. And Hans's curiosity set in once again. Hans decided he was tired of his way of life one day and left the boarding school to move to Geneva, Switzerland. Hans was only 19 when he got a job working as an apprentice for an international pearl exporting company. Hans noticed a pattern in the system of the company. All they did was sort out the pearls, grade them, and resell to jewelers. They didn't really create anything of their own, but they were still making really high profits. That was when he decided to learn their business tactics and began to make money of his own. Hans received a letter one day from his friend offering him a job at Kuno Korted, one of the biggest watchmaking companies at the time. This company made quality watches, and they shipped about 1 million Swiss francs in pocket watches yearly. Some of these watches were created from scratch by them too. To make things even better for Hans, the company was based in the town he always wanted to go to, Les Chaux de Fonds. His curiosity for the watchmaking business made him take the job over his job at the pearl company, which paid more. In 1900, Hans moved once again to La Chaux de Fonds to work for Kuno Korted as an English correspondent and clerk. His prowess for language made him a top pick for the job, and he was getting paid 80 Swiss francs per month. Hans was also required to wind hundreds of pocket watches every day and check to see if the time was accurate. At this time, he gained a lot of insight into watchmaking and became knowledgeable about how various types of watches were made. Unfortunately, Hans eventually had to fulfill his civic duty to Germany and went back home to serve in the army after working for 2 years. After completing his service, Hans traveled once again, this time to London, England, to work for another watchmaking company where he was responsible for increasing their sales. He worked here for 2 years and was able to grow the company over time. Hans knew he wasn't going to keep working for others forever. His own personal business was already in the works. Hey, time tells whether something would be good for you or not, in most cases. Subscribing to our channel, you don't need time to tell you to do that. So, what are you waiting for? Hans got married to Florence Frances May Crotty and became friends with her brother Alfred James Davis. They were discussing plans for the future when Hans told Davis he wanted to start his own watch business but just needed enough capital. Davis took a chance on Hans, and in 1905, the Wilsdorf and Davis Ltd. was born. This company would go on to become Rolex a few years later. Before the new name, they partnered with a Swiss watch company called Ermann Egler, another quality watchmaking company at the time, to import watches and watch cases into England from Switzerland. Soon after opening, Wilsdorf and Davis started creating custom timepieces for very affordable rates. Hans found a problem in the watchmaking industry at the time. He realized that pocket watches were more favored and accurate than wristwatches. The reason was that wristwatches were mostly worn by women as jewelry and weren't really capable of telling accurate time. They were smaller, and this meant less space to fit in mechanics for them to move accurately, making them go faster or slower. Hans found the pocket watch heavy, inconvenient, and stressful. Hans predicted that wristwatches would take over the watch industry, and he worked hard to realize this prediction. Hans traveled around Europe for several years to discuss minute details about watches with other watchmakers in Europe. At the same time, Hans began to produce his own wristwatches, making modifications to each new drop, catapulting his company to the top of the England watchmaking industry by 1908. Hans decided the name of his company needed to represent class and luxury and be very catchy and easy to say. He wanted the name to be short enough to fit in the dial of the watch, and he brainstormed for a long time on the name. He finally settled on Rolex, and the name resonated with him. Hans registered it as a trademark for his company. Rolex began to gain fame for producing high-end watches, causing more rich people to buy them. World War I broke out, and everyone expected Rolex to shut down like the other watch businesses, but they didn't. The reason was because Rolex wristwatches were so reliable that soldiers could wear them and know the time without having to reach into their pockets all the time. It also helped with coordination attacks because of its accuracy. By that time, Rolex was awarded the Class A Certificate of Precision by the London Q Observatory. In order to avoid the 33% tax Great Britain placed on exporting companies, Hans moved Rolex's headquarters to Switzerland. Besides this, the unpopularity of Germans after World War I led him to completely change the company's name to the Rolex Watch Corporation Ltd. in 1915. Rolex's trademark logo with the 5-star crown was registered 10 years later and still used today. The company moved headquarters again to Geneva, where it still stands today. Rolex began to produce watch movements in Bienne, transporting them to Geneva, where they were quality checked, designed, and launched. Hans proceeded to make his watches so good that the movements were guarded against damage caused by dust, sweat, heat, and cold. Rolex released their new model, the Rolex Oyster, in 1926. This model was the first ever waterproof wristwatch to be produced, but Hans didn't release it immediately. You'll see why. Hans employed Mercedes Gleitze, who claimed she could swim across the 20.5-mile English Channel. People didn't believe, so she prepared to do it again in front of people. Hans then told Gleitze to wear the Rolex Oyster around her neck while she swam about 4/5 of the way across the channel. She was pulled out of the water after almost freezing to death, and the Rolex model survived the 10-hour swim with no damage at all. This caused a chain reaction among people, and Hans made sure this reaction spread by putting an ad in the front paper of the Daily Mail. Rolex became known internationally at this point, especially because of the way Hans marketed the watch, in a fishbowl full of live fishes and water. In 1928, Hans also worked with Evelyn Lay, the top British model at the time, making her wear the watch inside a fishbowl. By 1933, again, Hans proceeded to relate his marketing with a crew that flew over Mount Everest wearing the watches and finding them in perfect condition after. Hans also employed the speed record of Malcolm Campbell when he drove at 300 miles per hour with his Rolex on in 1935. Rolex gained traction as a high-class brand, as well as watches that were perfect for any condition, career, and weather. Rolex released another model, the Rolex Oyster Perpetual, in 1931. It was the first ever self-winding and waterproof wristwatch. Hans lost his wife in 1944, and and he established the Wilsdorf Foundation, a charity organization for social causes in her honor. Hans made sure to transfer complete ownership of Rolex to the foundation before he died. As a result, Rolex can never go public or be sold or even pay taxes since it's under a charity. Rolex made more models, and one of their best releases was the Rolex Submariner, which would reach 100 meters deep in the ocean. Hans passed away in 1960, and Rolex became a high-luxury brand which targeted watch collectors and wealthy people. Hans created a successful brand out of nothing except his determination and hard work. He did this all the while never letting go of his passion, and still made groundbreaking changes in the industry, making him one of the most influential men to have ever lived. Oh, you should watch this video on the top 10 most expensive luxury watch brands on Earth. See Rolex's competitors too. Subscribe while you're at it, and thank you for watching.